Welcome everyone to our lesson overview for this week for July the 3rd. We are in Acts, and here's this week's lotto numbers apparently. No, just kidding. These are our various passages for which our lesson comes from. We're actually looking at a very large section of the Acts narrative this week. We're going to be jumping around in that. Our overview for the lesson is that Paul repeatedly gives a bold witness for Christ while in prison. That's the gist of what's going on here. So let's take a look at the context. Because we are looking at such a large part of Scripture, I want to go ahead and give you the overall passages in which you probably want to go ahead and read yourself so that you can get what's going on and why it's happening. These are chapters 21 through 26. Basically what has happened here, Paul has been arrested at the temple, and this has led to a very lengthy incarceration and trial process. And that trial process is where we find ourselves in our lesson for this week. There's a lot of characters involved here, Roman officials, Festus, Felix, King Agrippa II. There's a lot of things going on there, a lot of just cultural references that we need to kind of understand. So be sure, take the time and read over these chapters just so you get a good overview of what's happening here. So let's go ahead and get into our biblical truths on my unupdated slide from last week. Biblical truth for this lesson is that Paul took every opportunity to boldly proclaim Christ, even when wrongly imprisoned. Now, as we look at that biblical truth and we try to impart that to our classes, what we want them to learn, we want them to know is to examine how Paul purposed to honor God during his imprisonment. Obviously, it was not an easy thing for him to do, but we see him overcoming these adverse situations and honoring God in that. What we want them to do is to evaluate their ability to honor Christ regardless of what joys or difficulties comes. That's the end outcome that we want with the knowledge they learn from this lesson. So let me go ahead and just kind of give you something about Acts, about what Luke is doing in here. He is basically, throughout Acts, he's painting this picture of the gospel on trial. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to give you some references here in Acts where Luke talks specifically about how the gospel goes on trial. One of the things Luke is wanting to do with the Acts narrative, as he's writing to Theophilus there, is he is wanting to show Theophilus that it doesn't matter how often the gospel goes on trial, that there's no way that anybody is finding any fault with the gospel itself. They may disagree with it, they may be violently against it, but they can't really fault anything in the gospel or the apostles or the various missionaries' efforts to spread the gospel. So although we do see God's servants suffer for the sake of the gospel gospel itself is never found guilty, so to speak, in a trial setting. And that is one of the things that Luke is trying to do with the overall narrative of Acts, is show that, look, the gospel may have opposition, but you're not going to find where anybody can find true fault in it in and of itself, despite efforts to do so. So what does this lesson mean for us? What does this whole motif of the gospel being on trial mean to us? One thing that we do learn in this passage is that sharing the gospel will lead to more opportunities to share the gospel. Not all of them pleasant. Paul was sharing the gospel there in the temple complex. It's one of the reasons why he was there in Jerusalem. Not just to bring the offering he had collected to the believers in Jerusalem, but of course anytime he gets a chance, he's going to be telling about Jesus. And he was drug out, he was beaten, then basically arrested to save his life from the angry mob. And we see that kick off a whole series of opportunities for Paul to continue sharing the gospel. And these all weren't pleasant opportunities. He was imprisoned, we see a lengthy time. When he eventually does go to Rome, he suffers through shipwrecks and things like that. And so we need to understand that if we're going to be about the business of kingdom work, obedient to Christ, sharing the gospel, it is going to open us up more doors to share the gospel. But we shouldn't expect all of those doors that open up for us to be pleasant and to be easy. Same is true here with Paul. Also, the gospel will always be on trial. If we sit around and wait for the ideal opportunity, when we're going to have just the right person who is very pleasant and agreeable with us, and who's not going to give us grief over what we believe, who's not going to challenge us on the gospel, then we're going to be waiting forever, and we're never going to share the gospel. We're always going to find people who are going to put the gospel on trial. They're going to have questions. They're going to want to put the gospel to the test and see if it does stand up to truth. Some people will disagree, some more strongly than others. We see in this narrative how some of the Roman officials, they disagreed with Paul, but they weren't ugly about it. They wanted to hear more about the gospel, more about Jesus and what he had done. But in the end, they didn't really buy into it. They didn't believe, but they weren't ugly about it. And of course, then we're going to see the contrast in the angry mob that tried to kill Paul and still wanted to kill Paul because of the gospel. And so we need to understand people are going to disagree with us, some more than others, and some people will react more with disdain towards the gospel than others will. We may suffer for our obedience to God. Paul definitely suffered in his obedience in sharing the gospel. We too, if we're faithful in doing that, may suffer in various ways. We need to understand that we should faithfully share the gospel, even in difficult circumstances, and not be discouraged when people do not respond in faith. All these big people, these big Roman officials, these heavy, influential people that Paul witnessed to, we have no record in the Gospels or otherwise that they ever responded in faith to Jesus Christ. But yet Paul was not discouraged in that. He continued sharing, even when he stood before Caesar himself and shared the gospel. We know that Caesar did not convert and come to faith in Jesus Christ. And so we too should not be discouraged when we have those opportunities to boldly share faithfully who Christ is, what the gospel is, what Jesus has done for us. Even when people do not respond in faith to us, we need to continue to serve and continue to share faithfully and not gauge our obedience to Christ whether or not people respond faithfully to that, because then we're putting our feelings and our value of success and how we view that above the gospel, and we should not do that. So there are some important things for us to know as believers and for you to teach this week as you prepare your lesson and you try to drive home our biblical truth to the class. As always, if you've got questions about this lesson, any part of the context from chapter 21 to 26, don't hesitate to let me know. You can email me, send me something on Facebook, just give me a phone call. I'll be glad to walk you through that. And I'm always praying for you as you make this preparation for this lesson. And Lord willing, I look forward to seeing you this Sunday. Thank you all so very much.